Emily, it's so great to meet you. Yeah, I mean, I always suck at these intros because it's like we were just talking and then I have to act like we weren't. And so, yeah, you're good friends with Brandon Nicole and Felix Coons, who've both been on the podcast, and they were like, you have to get freaking Emily on. And so that means a lot.
So sweet.
So welcome to the show.
Thanks, Adam. I'm so happy and honored to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. It was kind of fun. I love my favorite thing about this show is like if you look at the 100 or 160, 170 episodes or so of guests that we've had and conversations that we've had, like it spans the gamut, right? So I have like you, Felix, and Brandy, right? And you guys all share a studio, right? Or a studio building at least.
Yeah, so Brandy and I are in the same studio, and then down the hall from us is Felix. So we have like a little photo commune here. That's
insane. I get so jealous of like your guys' rooftop stuff.
Come visit anytime.
Yeah, I want to. I told Brandy I expect to be well welcomed the next time I'm there.
Absolutely. We'll have streamers and confetti.
Yeah. Chocolate milk will pour down from the skies. No, that's my fantasy. It's very, very short-lived. But yeah, and so like we have you guys there, right? And so, you know, the general term for people who aren't like nitty-gritty is like you do fashion commercial.
Yeah, commercial fashion and portrait. My background is in portrait photography. I've been shooting for 10 years now, and the majority of that time is portraits. And so I think for a lot of photographers, that can be a hard transition to go from the portrait world into the commercial world. Everything is really, really different. Pricing's different. Marketing is different.
Sure.
And there's pros and cons, but ultimately I think there's a lot more pros than cons, and especially in the way that I like to work. So.
Yeah, no, totally. It's so funny because it's like I'm a wedding photographer and that's primarily what I shoot. Like 2019, I did a lot of corporate work and that was great. And kind of corporate event work. It's like this whole brands are hiring wedding photographers to shoot their high-end corporate events rather than just doing a commercial shoot, which I think is weird. Like it's the same budget, but they want this like hyper authenticity vibe to it. But then it's like, we'll have you guys on. We'll have, early this year we had Pete Souza, Obama's photographer, on.
That's so incredible. Congratulations. I mean, what a man to speak with.
Yeah, it's absolutely insane. Or have like Amy Vitale, or then you'll have big like wedding people, right? Like old school Jasmine Star, right? Or Maddie May.
So cool.
So weird, but it's super cool. So yeah, every guest I'm like,
I love a good mix in genres.
Yeah, 100%. Because it's like, I don't know. There's so many photographers that we don't know. And I think like the more as a community we keep knowing and finding, and we don't have to become ginormous fans of those people, but just to know that they exist and that there's like, there's always new creations and there's reiterations, and it's kind of like music. Like if there was a Spotify for photographers, you're like, no, this is where we all live. Like there's plenty of us to be around, and we could never know each other exists, but now we do.
Yeah, and it's cool that like each photographer, especially coming from different genres, like they all have this very unique perspective. And for me, like I love hearing that,
Yeah, no, totally. So tell me, I heard a little bit about you from Brandy, and I asked her to like give me the gist of of Emily. But tell me a little bit about your story. You said you've been shooting for 10 years. I know you're not originally from NYC. Like, where are you originally from? And then how did you make that transition to like moving to the big city? And like, was it scary? Did you quit? Did you fail? Like, what was that process like?
Oh man, I might ramble. So if at any point, feel free to cut me off. But thanks. I'm from a pretty small town. I guess my original hometown was Paradise, California, which was 27,000 people. And then as a teenager, I moved to Chico, California, Northern California still, which is about 90,000 people. So still very small town.
I love when you say 27,000 people is a small town. Like,
how do you consider a small town?
I'm pretty sure where I grew up was like 2,800.
Whoa. Okay. You win for small. I don't know if you call that a town. That's like an area.
Yeah. I mean, they had like buildings and stuff and pawn shops and, and Ames or Kmart. But yeah.
You definitely win for small town.
It's California though. So it's so different, right? Like
it's such a massive state. But yeah, when I was 16, my uncle, who I just admire so much, offered me a workshop at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York. It was like a 3-day workshop for teenagers to kind of try to pull teenagers into that world. And I could choose whatever class I wanted. And I was really intimidated to choose a class because despite being a really creative person, I'm really not good with my hands. Like my hands are these destructive things that do not make things, they destroy things. And so I was looking at painting workshops or embroidery, bead making, all these different creative workshops and all of them. I was just like, I don't know if I want to do that. And then with photography, I had some photographer friends in Chico who really inspired me. I was interested in it already. A few friends had asked me to like do local modeling for them. So there was already that like connection there. And so I thought, okay, I'll try this out. And then by the end of the first day of this workshop, I was like, I'm a photographer now. It was just like this title that I had taken on. And it was just the most reassuring feeling in the world because all of a sudden I had no direction before that. I didn't have great grades. I didn't have a lot of passions. And all of a sudden here's this thing where I could just pour myself into it. And I really did. Once I came back to Northern California, I was like, great. Now that I'm a photographer, I must set up photo shoots. And so, at 16, I started asking all my friends in high school, I'm like, will you model for me? And then it just kind of grew from there. So that I was really, really hungry to add to my portfolio, to get better, to learn. And then slowly I started doing shoots in other cities. So San Francisco is about 4 hours away, 3 to 4 hours away from Northern California, Chico.
Another small town.
Yeah, right. The small town of San Francisco. Yeah. And so I would go down there and network, or my brother had just moved to Los Angeles. And so I started going down and visiting him. And that was really exciting because at the time, Model Mayhem was a really big thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. The look that you just gave me is a lot of photographers' reactions whenever I say Model Mayhem.
I love it. And the name, it sounds so cool, but then, and again, like I probably wish, I think it's still around, but like if I wanted to do stuff like that, that's the first place I would go to look for people, to pay people who've had, a background or expertise or whatever. But I think there is just like a negative connotation because it's, creepy dudes or something like that.
Yep. So yeah, that's accurate. But at the time as a teenager, I was just, floored. I was like, oh my gosh, here is this entire world. Like everything I've ever been looking for is on this site. So as someone kind of starting out in photography, it was a wonderful resource. And I started setting up casting calls down in Los Angeles. And I remember my first time working with a quote unquote real model. I was terrified, but it was such good experience to kind of build my portfolio that way. And just the more that I kept shooting over the years, I definitely saw myself being pulled in more of a fashion direction. I love I was working with extravagant headdresses or these designers with really intimate details. And for a while it went all the way as far as fantasy photography, which now I feel very distanced from. But at the time it was like, wow, like let's make this as extravagant as possible, like as beautiful as possible. So at a certain point I kind of looked at my work, this fantasy work that I was doing, and I was like, how do I make money off of this? Because I was working full time as a photographer, just working for various publications. I was also doing photojournalism, but primarily it was portrait work and then a little bit of commercial work just from, local companies in Chico that were hiring me. And I knew that the fantasy work, even though I really loved it, wasn't making me money. And I at the time, it was like the only thing that I want to do is be a successful photographer and shoot what I love, right? So where's the middle ground? Like, I'm not necessarily in love with the kind of portraits that I'm taking, right? But I guess I kind of pulled that fantasy back to a more commercially viable thing, which was a more traditional kind of fashion. Sure. And that's kind of where I'm at now. But now it's fun because I almost felt like I went too far in that direction. And I started looking at my work and I was like, well, this is boring. So now I'm going in the other direction again, being like, okay, what makes my work unique? How do I kind of take my personal aesthetic, my heart, and really apply that to my photography? So it's a fun journey. And it's sometimes frustrating that after 10 years, I feel like, in so many ways I'm just starting still, and at other times I'm like, okay, you'll get there one day. I'm sure I'll be like 80 years old and I'll be like, yeah, but now my portfolio needs this, you know? And I think that's great though, because I mean, if you get comfortable with your work, I think you stop growing. So yeah, I'm happy to be uncomfortable.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I think, I just celebrated 10 years of weddings like the other day.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, it's kind of insane. Like just weddings, in the photography world, it used to be very kind of like, weddings. And now I feel like, obviously commercial photography can make a lot of money, but people look now at weddings as being the cash cow. And like, it's this thing that
absolutely.
Like, people were so scared of things like Instagram or the iPhone.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, it's going to devalue photography. And I'm like, plot twist, it overvalued photography. Everybody cares about this. Everybody knows that legacy and social proof and imagery and representation of all of us, like, it matters, and we get to do that. And, but it's like, there are people that come up to me on the street now, and they're like locally, and they're like, Adam, like, I love your work, or, oh, it's so cool, like, I listen to your podcast. And it's super weird. And I'm just like, oh, I don't feel like I have made it. This is something we've been talking about in our Facebook group recently. It was like, do you feel like you've made it? And it's like, I pay my bills, have huge savings, comparatively to like how I grew up, the small town vibes. I could buy a small town. No, I'm kidding. And it's like, but I do feel like we're making it, right? And I'm like, there's a soft goal, right? Like, so for me, my soft goal, I joke with people about is like, I want to retire at 45. So it's like, we have an aggressive savings and, and still have fun now. Yeah, and we might work past that, of course, but it's like I don't know any 45-year-old wedding photographers who are crushing it and are locally relevant. But I totally get the and you're in New York City, where it's like the hunger is there. You cannot rest on your laurels.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah, it's a really different environment from my quote unquote small town.
From Chico 90, if you want. Yeah.
But I mean, everything's so different. Again, and talking about that transition from portrait work to commercial work, it's tied also to that transition from Chico to New York. It's totally different. I was really spoiled in Chico because I didn't have to do a lot of marketing. Again, because there was only like 90,000 people, word of mouth was I'm gonna be rolling my eyes this whole time.
I love it so much.
With 90,000 people, it's easier to kind of rely on word of mouth. And I really did. And social media was huge for me. I'm grateful that even as a teenager, I started looking at that and being like, okay, how can I use this to its full extent, And I really did. Facebook, which is funny because I don't use Facebook much anymore, but at the time, Facebook was huge for me as far as getting my photography out there. Every time I did a shoot, I would be like, hey, if you post these photos, would you mind tagging me? And then other people would see my work. So I know that I have older photography friends who kind of look at me and they're like, I don't understand like what the point of social media is. And I get that too. You don't need social media by any means, but it can be such a tool. Yeah,
it's such a funny thing. Like for social media in general, I only recently, got my K or whatever. I talk about this a lot because so many photographers look at it as like, oh, this is when I'll make it, right? And again, it's like, nope. Like my mortgage does not reflect what is happening.
Totally.
But the idea of, even before that, Instagram was like one of my top 3 referral sources. I track all of that, and have a really strong CRM, and it's like, oh, I don't even feel like I'm trying at Instagram, other than the fact that I only put up the work that really feels like me and resonates.
Yeah.
And so there was creating this what's the version of a good vacuum? Like, it was only attracting, like, if a client inquired and they said, hey, I found you through Instagram, like, if they had the budget, we were booking. They were like, we didn't look at anybody else. Like, or like I had a bride tell me the other day, she's like, when I got engaged, I followed every DC wedding thing and then slowly unfollowed the things that I hated. And you're the only one left, or like you're one of 2 left or whatever. So it's such a weird thing. And so if like, at the time though, because I didn't have 10K, if you had asked me before I knew that it was a big source, I would have said, yeah, social media is stupid, right? Like whatever, we don't need it. But if we told our older photographer friends or maybe people who aren't on social, like, hey, Instagram alone is 6 figures of my business. Like,
yeah, right.
It obviously means something to me. And like, yeah, we wouldn't cry. We wouldn't, quit if when Instagram went away. But I'm not going to bite the hand that feeds right now, if you will.
Yeah, right. No, I think it's such a double-edged sword, right? And I think it's also how you respond to it, like who you have in your news feed. My mom and I have really different relationships with Facebook, for example. Like even though I don't use
I already
Facebook,
know where this is going.
Yeah. Even though I don't use Facebook much anymore, I like it. I used to love it. And I follow people that I guess most of my friends on there are photographers, right? And so the work that I see in my news feed inspires me. I'm like, wow, this is cool. Like, look at what this person is doing. And it feels really good to me. But for my mom, she follows all these political pages that are just angry. And so she has a really negative experience with Facebook despite, being really drawn to it. And it's just interesting that like who you follow and how you see the platform really makes a difference.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, that's, there's a lot of stuff going around the past year or two where it's like, hey, you don't have to follow people just to like fake support them, or you don't have to follow your competition, unless they're actually your friends and stuff like that. And, sometimes people get weird too. Like I think, I've definitely gone through the situation, man, we're getting way off topic here, but the situation of like, unfollowing somebody and then getting the text like, hey, why'd you unfollow you? And I was like, listen, it's just Instagram. And I feel like muting is wasting space. But if you'd rather maybe just mute you and never interact, fine. But like,
totally,
if this thing costs us our friendship, if we had a real friendship, then I'm like, then that's awful anyway. But catch me up with, we kind of talked with like getting back to New York, but like, how long was that transition from Chico to New York? Of the 10 years, if you will, right?
Yeah.
So when did you come to New York City?
So I came here, actually next month will be my 2-year anniversay of living here. But going back, I feel very recent, especially because like a year and a half has been COVID. So I've been inside a lot. Yeah. But also like, I mean, being with Brandy, my roommate here, like what a great way to, spend COVID. I can't imagine it being anywhere else. But
totally.
Before New York, kind of when I was 19, I didn't have a lot of direction. Again, I knew that I had photography though. That was like my one direction. But I guess going even further back, when I was 18, when I was deciding, do I go to college or not? I really had a tough time with that because I knew 100% the only thing that I want to do is photography. There is no backup plan. Like this is my everything. And so I was like, is it worth it to go to college for photography? And I think it's a lot of people go through that decision. And there's no right or wrong answer. I think however you spend it, hopefully you make the best out of the experience. Ultimately, I decided that all I wanted to do was photography and quote unquote, wasting time, which is not, I mean, college is such a great thing, but I didn't want to be sitting in classes, spending time on anything but growing my business, learning.
Totally.
Really just, I was so hungry to learn and have the best portfolio I possibly could. So I decided instead of spending all this money that I didn't have on going to college, I would save up and I would travel. And I did that for years. I got really hungry for travel, and the travel bug bit hard. And every new country that I would go to, I guess I would go to a new city and I would go on Model Mayhem and I would start setting up these shoots, right? Yeah, it was so fun. So, I mean, now I'm 25 and I've been to 30 countries. And it's one of the things that I hold really dear to my heart. Like that travel has influenced who I am as a person, but also my photography as well. Totally. And so I was just kind of a vagabond for a really long time. Like I could not stay in one place longer than 3 months. And I would constantly be working like crazy, like 70 plus hours a week so I could save up this money to go travel. And then of course I'm not making money while I'm traveling. So I'd lose all my money and then I'd be like, okay, time to save up again. It was just a cycle, which, for years was really good. But I also didn't feel like I had a really clear direction with where I wanted my photography to end up. And I knew that I was growing my portfolio, but I guess financially, like, okay, where is this money coming from? That was around the same time that I was looking at fantasy photography and being like, okay, maybe this isn't my direction. And I'll throw out a quick disclaimer that there's fantasy photographers that make bank and they've killed that fine art world.
Sure.
But I knew that I wasn't interested in that and going down that path. So at a certain point, there was once a job offer that I took in St. Louis, Missouri, working for ProEDU, which is a photography tutorial education company.
Yeah.
And I was really smitten with the offer because in my head, I was still, even though I was happy I didn't go to college, I still had this idea that like, okay, you will never find work. Like no one will ever hire you. It was just like that insecurity that fortunately I've worked through.
Totally.
But 3 years ago, I hadn't worked through it yet. So I accepted this position in St. Louis. I moved from Los Angeles, where I was living at the time, to St. Louis, Missouri. And I worked for them for 6 months. And it's an awesome group of people. But that was the moment where I was like, okay, I cannot go into an office every day and work at a desk. Like my brain cannot do it, And I was also so sad because in my head, I'd made all these reasons why I could still do photography on the weekends and why that would be enough for me.
Totally.
Spoiler, it wasn't. And so I told my friends there, I was like, I'm so sorry, but I can't do this. And they were very understanding. And so I moved back to California and then I got an opportunity. I'm going to speed through this a little bit. So if I need to slow down at any point, let me know. But
do your thing.
I also do documentary work and I do a lot of work revolving around human trafficking. So whether it's labor trafficking or sex trafficking. And I had already done a project with Free the Slaves, which is an organization based in DC, actually, where you are. And we had gone and worked together in Ghana for about a month and a half, focusing on child slavery and fishing villages. And that was really where I was like, okay, even though fashion and commercial work is what is going to pay the bills and documentary work I don't see ever paying the bills for myself, like it's still really important to do that work for my heart and feeling like in some way I'm giving back. And so I reached out to other organizations that Free the Slaves had connected me with, and I got an opportunity to work in India, also for about a month, maybe a little over a month. Working with victims of sex trafficking. And so I had just come back to California from doing this trip. So just as far as the timeline and organizing this, I left ProEDU, I went to India, I came back, and now I'm like, okay, it's time to get serious and save up money and move to LA because that's where the work is. And so then plans changed. So in that time, Felix Koons, who a really talented photographer, lovely human, he goes to South Africa every year for about 2 months. And this time he said, I'm subleasing my apartment. I'm looking for a photographer for this opportunity. And I remember just commenting on his Facebook status being like, wow, and the travel bug in me was like, let's do it. But I was also, I'm like, okay, you have just turned into an adult. You have to like get your eggs in a row and ducks in a row. I was like, no more of this just like jumping around and spending all your money. Like you need to be serious about photography and you can't do that if you don't have any money. And if you're always gone, you can't always take on these new clients,
Sure.
And so I ended up talking with him about it and I was like, Felix, I can't do this. It's just not going to work. For anyone who doesn't know Felix, he is the most convincing man in the world. It's very dangerous for him to ever want something. And so maybe 2 weeks later, he comes back to me. He's like, Emily, can I just show you around through FaceTime? Like, no worries. If not, I just want to show you the studio. And that got me. That was it.
This space is awesome.
Oh, it's incredible. Yeah. And then I started justifying it. I was like, okay, yes, this is expensive and I don't have the money, so I'm going to have to put it on a credit card. However, I will be in New York, which is a fashion capital, and I'll be working with incredible talent and connecting with stylists and designers. And, it's just for 2 months and then I'll get really serious and I'll move to LA. And so I went to New York about, I think it was like 4 days later. It was a really short timeline. And that's why Felix was so desperate to get someone in there. Yeah. And so I go there and Brandy Nicole, also an insanely talented photographer, was subleasing his roommate's room. And so we met by living together for the first time. And the first couple of days we were like a little shy and we're very polite to each other. But after about a week, it's like, okay, it turns out we're best friends. And so we're like, wow, this is such an amazing life. Like, how do we replicate this situation? And to skip over all the details, we ended up finding an apartment right down the hall from Felix. And so we're like, great, now we live in this commune. And so
awesome.
I totally changed my plans. I was like, it turns out LA is going to have to wait because now I live in New York. And I remember telling Brandy, I was like, I have to be honest. I have to give you a warning. Like, I don't stay in one place. Like, I am going to make a 6-month commitment to you, but I can't make anything more than that. And she's like,
Yeah.
okay. And then, of course, it didn't take long to realize that, wow, I love New York and I love living with her. And I finally set down roots. So I've never done that before. Yeah. So now New York is home. And then kind of the first 6 months of living here, I was just hustling like crazy. I was going to networking events. I was reaching out to brands. I was pitching myself. I was building my portfolio. It was just like everything is coming in roses, and I was picking up clients, which was really exciting. And then the pandemic hit.
Wow.
And so it was, everyone can say it was insane. It was just like, all of a sudden it's terrifying to even go outdoors, and we don't know if we hang out with a friend, if that's going to kill us or not. I mean, it was, especially in New York, which was an epicenter, it was a really, really scary thing. So then I started taking on brand work, which I had done in the past, community management work. So currently I work with a lot of different brands to help them with seeding, which is where let's say one of my brands is Ellen Chrome, which is a lighting company. So I will find really talented photographers with large followings, and we'll create a collaboration where I'll send them a light or a softbox. And I say, hey, if you like this, no pressure, but if you do like this, can you talk about it? And that's a lot of the work that I've been doing that, thankfully I've been able to survive COVID because of that. So yeah,
that's cool.
That was a long ramble. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Well, and especially in New York, like, other photographers, and being a photographer, even, at your age, like you have 10 years. So it's like, people around the industry, and you kind of serve them. That's so funny.
And community has always been really, really important to me. So, without realizing that it would pay off one day, I mean, it paid off for my heart, but I've been networking with other photographers since I was a teenager and going to trade shows. And so I had already had this really well-developed community. And so when this opportunity came along, I'm like, wait, I get to help my really talented friends by giving them gear, and that also helps a company, and I get paid. That's cool. So a lot of the pandemic was just spent working with different brands. So currently under my belt, I have Ellen Chrome, Capture One, Nanlite, Timba. And unfortunately, it's at the point where I have to let a couple of those brands go, because now the world has started back up and client work's starting to come in. And, it's a really busy time now where it's like, okay, I can only juggle so many things. Something has to go,
Yeah. And do those things well, right? And
yes, absolutely. Yeah. You can only, I guess you can technically do all the things, but you're going to be spread really, really thin. And then, I think for a lot of photographers, for people that are ambitious, if you're not doing a good job at something, that really eats at your heart, which is definitely where I'm at.
At least.
Yeah, right.
You should meet some of our second shooters. No.
Oh, no.
No, that's so funny. That's awesome. Yeah, it's interesting with the community management thing, like how that kind of hopefully, I assume, saved the day, at least for a while,
Oh, totally. There's no way that I would have been able to stay in New York, which would have been really heartbreaking, because for the first time, I'm like, I love it here so much. Like, I never want to leave. And so, that was everything for me. And unfortunately, a lot of my photographer friends have had to leave the city. And so I feel for them. And I'm also very grateful to these brands for, allowing me to stay here during this time. And also grateful that it's finally like, I'm looking out the window, like, it's almost over.
How does, and I feel like yesterday or the day before, NYC announced no restrictions.
It's pretty wild. So people are still wearing masks indoors, but definitely a lot more people aren't wearing them outside. And it just feels like a normal world is so close. How is it in DC?
It's pretty similar, I feel like, to New York City, probably the whole time, honestly, where, I'm assuming this is the case for New York City, where maybe those masks aren't required indoors unless it's required privately by the business's discretion.
Right.
Which I think is totally fine, or whatever. And then there are a group of people that is slowly decreasing in size that wears a mask inside to be polite or performative or actual fear or, just socially, they don't want to be the weird outcast or whatever. Which I will say probably like a week ago, I was like, okay, I'm reading every sign. And if it says, if you're vaxxed, you can go in without a mask, I'm taking off my mask. Like,
yeah, totally. Right.
Listen, everybody, like that's the point of getting the shot and promoting all this stuff. But it's pretty similar to that, but you'll still see, people wearing masks just in case, again, some of it's everybody's first pandemic. So that's what I say. Like, everyone's going to handle it differently. And the intentions are good no matter what. Usually, like if somebody wears a mask to my door and then because they're going to hang out and they take it off when we hang out, I'm like, I don't care. I'm like, you didn't have to do that, but they're trying to do that to be nice or to check our boundaries, which I think is important. So, this conversation's gotten everywhere. Fuck.
No, but I mean, just kind of relating what you're saying back to photography, though, and I know that you've felt this in the wedding industry. I've felt this in my industry. It's like not being able to shoot for a long time, and then when you do start shooting, it's like there's so many regulations, right? Like for me, I mean, everyone had to have a mask. You had to have temperature checks. You had to have a negative COVID test. And I'm sure for the wedding world too, like I can't even imagine what that was like for you guys.
Yeah. I mean, it was basically nothing, so like, especially in DC, depending on where you restrict where you lived, right? So like I said, like the East Coast, DC, New York City, Boston, Seattle, LA, very similar, guidelines and vibes, and based on people we talked to, and probably like 80% of our work rescheduled or canceled. And then there were people who had smaller events or pivoted or whatever and all that kind of stuff. We were basically masked the entire year, and we were masked most of this year so far until now, where it's like, okay, what's the venue requirement or what's the state's requirement, but now too, at least the couples I attract, like they brag about it in their email. They're like, hey, most of our guests are vaccinated. Let's roll. I'm like, cool.
So cool. That's awesome.
Like, let's hug and make out and whatever. Like, make up for the last 18 months.
I love it so much. I've just recently, my last few shoots have been maskless. And like, there's this moment where I'm like, this is cool, right? And I'm like, oh yeah, we're all vaccinated. This is cool. But it's great, and there was the time where, I don't know if this affected the wedding industry at all, but we started doing remote shoots. Did you ever get into that?
No, that was not attractive to me at all.
Yeah, me neither. Because it's like, the purpose of photography in my mind is like capturing emotion, right? And I'm sure there were some really great remote shoots, but in my mind, it's like, this is not what I do. This is not my job. This is not why I became a photographer, So getting rid of that, I'm excited about.
Yeah. What is, so what does your primary workload look like now? Like when did, post moving into Felix's sublet during the South Africa time, when did things start picking up to where you felt like you were comfortable or could pay your bills or whatever, even with community management, when did that kind of hit?
I guess pretty immediately. So before I moved to New York, I had taken on Ellen Chrome, which was just part-time. And that was like, okay, I've got at least rent covered by this thing, right? And awesome. I was spoiled to like have that, because otherwise, I mean, I would have definitely gone into debt moving here while you're trying to pick up and get new clients coming on. So, I mean, something that I always recommend to photographers is like, make sure that you're safe before you take the leap, Yeah. And so I had that coming in, and then it was just like constant pitching myself to the point where it was really good back in like November, December, January before COVID hit. It was just so disappointing because I finally felt like I was on the right track. Like here I am, I finally set down my roots. I am really happy with my apartment, with my roommate, with my life, with where my photography's at. And I'm living the dream, right? Like I'm taking on all these clients to the point where I didn't have to do the brand work. And then it was just like gone, in a second. Right. And I think it was probably my first client shoot again was in July of last year. And that was like the first one where we're all on set with masks. And it was like, there were social distancing like regulations. And so just now, I would say in the past 2 months, slowly like inquiries are coming back in. And now I'm at the point where I'm like, okay, So I'm in this big transition period currently where, and it'll be funny when this podcast comes out, but actually on Monday is when I'm leaving two of my brands, just because there is, thankfully there's too much work coming in that I can't juggle everything. So
Sure, totally.
I kind of have this big plan set up where the way that I organize my life is through my journal and through like to-do lists and check boxes. And I actually have it sitting right next to me. It's like everything in my heart and my mind is all in this journal, right? And so I guess I have the plan that, okay, Monday, I'm going to leave these two brands. I'll give them 2 weeks notice. And then after that is when I start aggressively pitching myself. So I already have a list of different brands that I want to pitch myself to, and then different agencies I'll start pitching myself to in August. And yeah, it's a lot of outreach, which I wish that wasn't the case, but I think people become photographers obviously because they're passionate about photography. And then, you realize there's all the administrative work, which is not a lot of fun, but also, it can be exciting too, because you get to think, okay, this is going to lead to X opportunity. And
When it's, I'm a big fan of that outreach, like you called it. And outreach is something that I think I've mentored photographers for years, and it's like, it's free. I'm a big proponent of SEO, and like I got a DM today from somebody who watched like an old workshop or something, and they're, you can just tell that and this is not, I don't know this person, but there's some element you can tell in the DM where it's like, do you really want this at all? Is this not worth it to you? Like if I told you just had to write 5 blog posts and share work that you already got paid to create, and then you would make more money from that, and it was free to do it.
Yeah.
And all you need to do is just fucking write.
It's insane. It's like you actually get to handpick your potential clients in a way, right?
Yeah.
And again, comparing it to how I worked in Chico versus how I work in New York, it's totally different. And I really got to be lazy with my marketing in Chico. And I don't think there was ever a brand I reached out to back then. It was just they came to me, and in my mind, I was like, and that's how photography works, and it can be, it totally can be. But when you move to a massive city with a lot of competition and no one knows who you are, I think the only way, and I'm sure someone could prove me wrong on this, but at least in my mind, the only way is to actually shout your name out there as loud as you can and go and pitch yourself, and be like, hey, here's who I am. This is what I do. Would you like to work together? And
unless you have an agent, but then it's even then you need to be unique enough or good enough to be taken on by the right agent. You have to have the right clientele, that kind of stuff too. So
even that, and I don't have an agent, but a lot of my friends do. And I'm always so curious, and I ask them a lot of questions like, hey, tell me about this. Is it worth it? Is it not? Because I think for many years I thought if I only had an agent, everything would be fine. They would take care of it all. And it's pretty unanimous between everyone being like, yes, my agent's helpful, but I still have to be doing outreach and pitching. And it's not like your agent's finding you all of the work, right? And
your agent's not filling your calendar. It's
It's
sprinkling in some of the
right. And there's also the downside of then your agent's going to take likely 30%. And so, there's pros and cons. And I do think that's still a dream. Absolutely. But, I guess I'm rid of that mindset where I'm like, if I just had an agent, then I could get all the work in the world,
Totally. Yeah. I mean, especially something I'm really big on is outreach, like you mentioned, or, I think I said this on a podcast, some other person's podcast like years ago, and they loved it as a thing. But it was kind of the idea of like people who are like, oh yeah, I'd really love to do like food and brand and restaurant photography. And I was like, but I don't know where to get started, or no restaurants are reaching out to me, even though I offer it. And it's like, do you eat? Take a photo of what you eat. And, or like, again, everybody else, what we create is everybody else's tool for them to make money.
Yep.
They know that, or money or influence or whatever. They're going to find somebody to help them do that. It's okay to put your name in the hat and put out 100 question marks. And if you get one yes, like that's what matters. And I think, I talk about this a little bit in just like my own Instagram strategy or whatever. Like once you find your like ideal client in the wedding world, you can kind of be like, okay, what does that look like? Or what do they do? You find their hobbies or whatever. But even like, for you, like you having a list of brands, I think is like really encouraging to her. Like, yeah, this is my plan of action. Or like I always say here, this has a negative connotation, but I'm always like, what am I going to go to war with? I'm like, all right, it's time to go to war. It's time to like get pumped and go for it. And
totally,
and again, it's free. You know, write the template email or customize the template email. Like it's there's just so many people that are just like, it's work and all this stuff. Like, you know, and I'm like, we at some level, and I understand it's very privileged, but at some level, if your work is good, you're in charge of the marketing. You're the agent now.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Instead of saying I don't have an agent, be like, I am the agent. Or like Captain Phillips, I am the captain now. You know, and but people, it's like, I don't know. You know, I make fun of the small town jokes. But like that's just because that's part of my story. Is like I grew up in a small town, raised by a single parent. I was kicked out of college, and then like now I profit 6 figures doing wedding photography, and I'm a nobody. There are, you know, Harvard graduates doing photography out here. There are trust fund babies out here doing photography. There are Martha Stewart's best friends doing photography out here. I'm a nobody, and I'm doing this. And I'm doing it without ads or without being schemy or weird. And I have probably the best relationship with my clients and the best, I would say, a really good core of people who root for me and ambassadors.
Yeah,
and,
I love that.
And I'm doing that without being awful. So if I can do it, like, why can't you? And it's
totally.
But people are just weird. And I think photographers in general, too, like, well, I have nothing to show. I have nothing to blog. Well, hey, you know the answer to that, girl. You know
go create it.
You got to go press that button, baby.
Yeah, right. Like, I mean, God, there's so much that I want to touch on. That, you know, the first is exactly what you're saying. I mean, I have so many younger photographers, like in high school, who will come to me and be like, I want to work for National Geographic. What do I do to get there? And I'm like, go shoot. you know, or I mean, it's just, you can't do it unless you shoot the thing a lot, and it's hard work, and it's going to take years and years and years and years. But it's also, you know, I hope that hard work is also hard work that you love. You know, I mean, every single photo shoot I do, whether it's a test or it's for a client, I feel grateful to be doing it. It's like, I get, hopefully it's like, I get paid for this. What? And even if it's a test shoot for your portfolio, it's like, I mean, those ones are the best of all, because you're shooting exactly what you want. Like, you get to be the client, you get to decide every single detail. And it's like, man, how lucky.
And it goes back to what you talked about earlier with, this is something I love and I'm a big proponent of, is kind of talking about the fantasy photography and then deciding like, could I still do something that is close to this? Shoot, create, storyboard, come up with aesthetics with brands, mood boards, that kind of stuff. You know, could I still do something very close to this and make it commercially viable? Can I pay my bills? Can I have a little bit of savings, a little bit of retirement? You know, like the same things that you would get in a normal job. And it's like, if you can, and it's still better than doing anything else, like, let's go. That's my thing is like 80%, you know, 100% is like, I'm an artist and I only shoot what I love. And if you can do it, that's like the 1% of the 1%, you know, kind of thing. Like, awesome, go for it.
Right.
Those people aren't in New York City, probably, you know, because they have to fight. You have to do some level of, hey, I need your attention on my work, and I promise once you'll like it, you'll pay me, you know, at some level. And it's like, there are days when, like yesterday, I pulled like a 15 or 16 hour day, and I wasn't even shooting. I was just like editing and admin and all that stuff. But it's like, I'd rather do this than something else.
Absolutely.
You know? Like,
totally.
I'm the boss, baby. You know, like, it's just like, I don't know.
And also it's like, you are choosing to work that 16-hour day, right? Like it might, like, you get to set those hours. And if at a certain point, I mean, maybe you can't because it's a fast deadline coming up, but like, if you want to, you can just like leave the house and be like, and now it's time for this break. You know, that's one of the coolest things about being a freelancer is it's really all up to you. Or like, I'm so in love with that part of it.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you get to, what if your professional boundaries came pretty close to matching your personal boundaries? And you never get a phone call from your boss because you're the boss.
Right.
You know? Which people look at the downside of it, but I'm like, like, it's worth it, you know? You know, or you talked about pros and cons of commercial work, but I think people who maybe don't know, it's like, you know, and I'm not even sure if these are your gigs, but it's like, I know commercial photographers who, they probably spent $3,500 on just doing a spec shoot, portfolio,
absolutely,
a whole design kit, all this kind of stuff. But they're going to win a gig that is $150K or something like that. Right. And they're going to have $40K in expenses, staff, catering, you know, health insurance, all that stuff. But then, hey, maybe they're still taking home whatever the remainder of that is. And yes, technically that's still revenue and they're still going to have to do some work, but like the numbers can be huge, you know, and I think people, and that's how you get to live in New York, everybody. No, but, you know, but like that's.
No, but you touch on such a good point is that, you know, for the test shoots, for the stuff that you're going to add to your portfolio, shoot exactly what you want to be booked for, right? Like shoot your dream project that you're like, I want to be paid for this, right? And then also all that work coming in that you're not in love with, whether, I mean, if you're on the wedding side, if it's a small backyard wedding that doesn't have a great aesthetic, or, you know, on the commercial side, if you're shooting for a dentist, you know, you will never find a dentist on my website. However, I might shoot for him, you know, like there's so much work that I take on that will never live on my website because it doesn't match what I want to be offering. And it doesn't match, it's not cohesive, you know, but it is, those test shoots are so important. And I know that's why people are booking me, right? Because they see that aesthetic, they see exactly what I want and what I can create for them. And it's a little heartbreaking when, you know, they'll look at your portfolio and they see this really extravagant, cool image that was a test shoot. And they're like, great, I'm going to hire you because of that image. And now I'm going to hire you to shoot something super boring. And it's like,
Brandy and I talked about this.
Right. Brandy is such a great example of it. Yeah.
Her Instagram is like, you know, you would think that she is making money off of her self-portraits, you know, and she might be actually, but as far as like, I mean, like the fullest version of her income necessarily. And I think it can happen. I think it's like one of those things where it's going to take time though, and some people don't want that time, or like your mortgage isn't waiting, you know, there's no there's no moratorium on mortgages and rent you know, still. So I mean,
just kind of going back to Brandy, it's hard for anyone who doesn't know her work, but Brandy Nicole, she's an amazing self-portrait artist, very like whimsical, feminine style. But you know, someone could look at her work and be like, oh, well, she's a portrait photographer, and maybe make an assumption about, you know, what she's making or something like that. But it's like, oh, on the side, she's also doing like $20,000 jobs for Microsoft. And it's like, you know, but is she ever going to share that work? Of course not, because it doesn't match her overall aesthetic. And I think that's so important for photographers to understand, is like, take all the work, you know, like just because you take the work doesn't mean that you only have to do that kind of work now. I mean, I've shot for restaurants, I've shot food photography, you know, there's so much that you shoot that you don't have to show, that you don't even have to talk about. But I also think it's cool to talk about just for transparency's sake. Yeah,
no, totally. I think there's an element where photographers, and I think last year helped a lot of us become more open, but there's still some element of, you know, everybody's an iceberg. We only see the top 10%, you know, and both emotionally and like workload and what's going on in their lives and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, for us, 2019, I was shooting so much corporate stuff that, you know, my wife and some friends asked me, they're like, well, why do you shoot weddings anymore? You know, do you, you know, in 2019, I shot 42 weddings. So if they're asking, why do you shoot weddings anymore? They're like, why? And the corporate work was like more than the weddings. And I was like, you know, because the corporate work might run out, or, you know, I don't know. And like all these kinds of things. And I really like and passionate about doing these weddings. But like at the same time, my SEP IRA is fully funded the past 3 years, and hopefully it gets fully funded. And man, if that's the only reason I take corporate work is to make sure I can retire at 45, like,
totally.
I don't care. You know, it's not going to be pretty. And again, like my story is like, man, guys, if I can do it, like, come on, all y'all can make it happen. So
if the money's there, go after it. You know, absolutely.
Yeah, and there are usually, you know, good gigs and that kind of stuff. I encourage a lot of people. Like, it's weird because I talk to a lot of photographers, especially this past few weeks as we're talking about like SEO stuff, is they're like, they put everything on their site and they're like, I offer everything. And, you know, and there are a few exceptions of people who do not niche down and they are still successful. But I believe that they had a time in their life when they were niching and it was incredible. And that niche was really good and it attracted other things, kind of like, you know, do you want 3 little fires, or do you want to build one big fire and then slowly start other fires from that, you know? And, you know, there's so many photographers who they say, but I like doing headshots, or, you know, like I would do them, you know, $500 a pop or $1,000 a pop down here in DC for like you know, crazy, awesome headshots. And I'm like, you can still do that. Like, you have a photographer on your website. They're probably still going to email you or like make a new website. They're like, but I have to make a new website. I'm like, it's $10. Okay.
Yeah,
Jeff?
right. Totally.
You know, or whatever your name is. I'm like, listen, and again, if this is what you want, This is called work. So if you can get what you want by a little bit of work, like when this episode became really preachy, there's just there's a lot of complainers out there, and I'm just like, come on, if Emily and I could do this.
Yeah, and what you just said about creating the different websites is such a great point, right? So like, for example, and this isn't what I want to do, so I'm not doing it. But if I was more desperate for money and I wanted this, I could, I can have my Emily Teague brand that's like, okay, great, I shoot fashion, portrait, and that's it, which I do. But then on the side, I could also create another brand, and this is Coffee Cup Inc.,
right,
which
commercial or something. Yeah.
And that could only be headshots, right? Or it could only be shoe photography or food photography. Like you can have all these different brands and you don't need to attach your name to it, right? You can come up with a totally different name. So like maybe because Emily Teague is that's me, like that's your main brand, right? But come up with, you can have a food business on the side that is under a certain name or another business that's under a certain name. And you can market those differently so they're not affecting your main business.
Yeah, no, 100%. What are you, tell me a little bit more as we round the end, tell me a little bit more about your plan of action for pitching. What's that look like for people who are listening, probably primarily wedding photographers? What's that even look like for somebody like you? What do you need to show them? Are you showing them, hey, here's my site? Do you have a specific portfolio made? What's that kind of process look like for you?
So the way that I do this, let's say I have my spreadsheet with all these different brands, right? And then I have different templates, but let's say I have a general template email, right? And it's like, hi, blah, 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 right? And number one thing that I'm going to recommend is like brands get so many of these emails and they can smell out the emails that are sent to everyone. So you really have to put in the work to customize it, not just a single line, but like every single email, go through it and talk about specific stuff about that brand. Like, hey, I'm reaching out because you are a brand that has a really feminine and sophisticated style, and that matches my photography. And then later in the email, be like, hey, I saw this campaign that you did about blah, blah, blah. I really connected to that. I mean, just make it feel personal. And so I'll start with that generic template, and then each brand gets a different customized template. And then I also have different PDFs that I'm attaching to that email. So depending on what kind of brand it is, maybe it's a brand that I'm pitching to them because I want to do a lookbook for them, right? So I will include a PDF of, I guess, depending on what kind of lookbook, let's say it's an on-location lookbook because that's what most of their work is. I'll only include my on-location images in that PDF. However, if I'm trying to pitch myself for e-commerce work, which, I'm like cringing as I say that just because I really don't want to do that, but maybe it's some kind of in-studio work, right? Like it's a jewelry campaign or something like that.
Sure.
I'm going to take this in a different direction. Let's say it's a jewelry campaign, right? Then I'm only going to be including actual jewelry stuff or beauty work stuff within that world. So you look at your entire portfolio and then you pick and choose and put different things together based on the potential client. And then, it sounds like a lot of work, but it's not so bad because you have your generic template that you're only tweaking a little bit. And then you have these PDFs that are already saved. So you have PDF 1, which is your on-location work, PDF 2, which is your studio work, PDF 3, which is your beauty work. And then you just kind of drag and drop, right?
Right. No, totally. I love that. Yeah, I think there's something too where I know when I've approached brands and other friends have approached brands too, is like, let them know what problems you can solve, or like if you can have a specific, if you're not emailing like info@google.com, you're finding a specific person who's the marketing manager or the comms director or that kind of person. And maybe too, like you said, like acknowledge a past thing that they did that you thought was really cool, or you're like, hey, you can even use some communications background to say like, it really feels like you guys are aiming for this. If that's true, I really think I'd be a good fit for this because of here's my work, that can align. Because I think like once they find it, if they know it clicks with them and it sounds right, then hopefully you're hired forever. As long as that comms manager there, or as long as their ad direction and creative are going the same direction, probably until they hire somebody else. Like they can be your client forever,
Totally.
And I know one of my big corporate clients, like I've had for 6 years, and you just get that trust, and eventually you get the big gigs, and they're just like, that's Adam. He gets it.
Exactly. It's building that relationship. But totally. I mean, it's one of the most important parts, and that's how you get returning clients. Instead of going after going after a client, doing an okay job for them, not being personable, and then not coming back to you, and then you go after a new client and you keep doing that. I mean, I have friends of mine who have one client and that client pays all of their bills, and they keep coming back to them every single month. And it's like, that should be the goal for all of your clients, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. It's like it might not seem like this, and photographers are very like independent people, but even in the wedding world, like now that I'm in my 30s now, I'm like, I want to work with people I like and like working with.
Totally. Oh my gosh.
Every weekend. And so that's the same for brands and stuff like that. And it's like, hey, like if this is going to be a good ongoing relationship, like let's do that. And I even tell my corporate brands and corporate clients, I say, hey, like if there's something I could do better, let me know, because let's say, on this project, you would give me an 8 out of 5 out of 10 or 8.5 out of 10. If there's something I can do to take this to a 9, it's a lot easier to tell me than just say, screw it, let's go look again for a stranger and try and build them up to get the culture of our brand.
Absolutely.
You know, so like brands like that. And if you've ever watched The Office, you know that it's cheaper to keep an employee on than to hire a new person. So
yep. No, I couldn't agree with you more. There's so many cases where, I mean, because I have clients that are hiring me, but then I'm also a client hiring my hair and makeup artist, hiring my stylist, hiring my videographer. I have my whole team underneath me. And I have experienced it in the past where like maybe I'm working with someone and yes, they're really talented, but their energy on set is not good. And that energy is going to affect me. It's going to affect the rest of my team, and it's going to affect the client. And ultimately it's going to affect the photos. Right. And so I would say this, and I'm sure so many people would agree. I would rather work with someone slightly less talented who I want to be around, because I mean, this is your family, like this is your crew, and everyone, you all work together to create something. I mean, it's not in fashion for sure. It's not just about the photographer, I mean, my work got better when I started working with more talented teams, when I started working with great hair and makeup artists, great stylists. And there's only so much that an individual can do. I mean, truly, I can't emphasize enough how important your team is. And to work with people that you actually like is really important.
Yeah, no, 100%. I love that. Well, Emily, thank you so much for coming on. Where can people go to cheer you on and find out more about what you're doing, and hopefully see some new work that you're going to be putting out? Yeah,
on Instagram, I'm at _ Emily Teague, EMILYTEAGUE. And then my website is emily-teague.com.
Boom.
You can also find me on YouTube at Emily Teague.
That's right. That's what we recorded in the intro, is that you're doing some YouTube stuff, which is really cool.
Yeah, it's pretty fun. I'm doing I do a monthly class for Adorama, which is a major photo retailer. And I mostly teach about lighting. I also teach some about fashion, but I'm finally at the point where I'm like, okay, I should start creating stuff for my own channel as well.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Emily.
Thank you. It was so nice.